The morning of April 12, 1862, dawned cool and damp over the railroad depot at Big Shanty, Georgia, a small station on the vital Western and Atlantic Railroad. The locomotive known as the General steamed into the station, its 4-40 Neo-American-type engine hissing to a stop. Passengers and crew, anticipating the scheduled 20-minute breakfast break, disembarked and headed into the adjacent hotel. Among them was the train's conductor, William Fuller, a man known for his punctuality and dedication to the line. As Fuller sat down for his meal, he was unaware that he was at the epicenter of one of the most audacious plots of the American Civil War. Seated among the passengers were 20 men who were not interested in breakfast. They were led by a tall, striking civilian named James J. Andrews. His companions were not civilians. They were Union soldiers, volunteers from 3 Ohio infantry regiments, all dressed in plain clothes, having traveled hundreds of miles deep into hostile territory to reach this exact spot. Andrews, a known contraband merchant and trader who operated between the lines, was a civilian spy for the Union cause. He had selected Big Shanty for one specific, critical reason. The station had no telegraph office. It was a blind spot in the Confederate communication network. As Fuller and the other passengers settled in, Andrews gave the signal. The 20 raiders moved with quiet purpose. They walked calmly past the Confederate guards stationed at the depot, who were present precisely because Big Shanty was a military camp. The raiders' nonchalance was their best defense. In a matter of seconds, they uncoupled the General and its tender from the passenger cars. They also took 3 empty boxcars positioned just ahead. The men climbed aboard, the engineer opened the throttle, and the General steamed out of the station. Inside the hotel, the sound of the departing locomotive caused confusion. Passengers and crew dropped their forks. William Fuller ran to the door and stared in stunned disbelief as his train vanished down the track. The audacity of the act was staggering. A team of Union agents had just stolen one of the Confederacy's most important engines in broad daylight, from under the noses of an entire military encampment. Fuller's reaction was not one of defeat. It was immediate and visceral. He, along with his engineer and one other railroad man, Anthony Murphy, did the only thing they could. They began to run. The 3 men, in their conductors' uniforms, sprinted down the wooden ties of the track, chasing the smoke of the General as it disappeared on the horizon. On board the stolen locomotive, the raiders looked back and saw the 3 figures running after them. They were amused, not threatened. They had a locomotive, and their pursuers were on foot. It was a fatal underestimation. The raiders knew how to steal a train, but they did not know William Fuller. His determination was singular, and his response to the theft was not bureaucratic. It was deeply personal. The chase had begun. This encounter set in motion a chain of events that would become legendary. James J. Andrews' plan was more than just train theft. It was a strategic military operation designed to deliver a decisive blow to the Confederacy in the Western theater. This chapter, however, will only set the stage for the chase, as the final outcome remains to be seen. In the early spring of 1862, Union General Ormsby Mitchell was advancing his army on Huntsville, Alabama. His ultimate objective was the strategic city of Chattanooga, Tennessee, a vital industrial hub and railroad nexus for the South. But Chattanooga was supplied by a single artery, the Western and Atlantic Railroad, which ran south to the industrial heart of Atlanta. Andrews, who had spied for Mitchell before, presented a bold and simple plan. He would lead a small team of volunteers, penetrate deep behind Confederate lines, and seize a northbound train. As they raced toward Chattanooga, they would destroy the railroad. Their mission was to tear up track, cut the telegraph lines, and, most importantly, burn the numerous covered wooden bridges that spanned the rivers. If they succeeded, Chattanooga's supply line would be severed, the city would be isolated, and General Mitchell's army could seize it, an act that might have shortened the entire conflict. To accomplish this, Andrews selected 22 volunteers from the 2nd, 21st, and 33rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry Regiments, along with one other civilian, William Campbell. They were told the mission was secret and extremely hazardous. Traveling in small groups and in civilian attire, they made their way south, navigating hundreds of miles of hostile territory to rendezvous in Marietta, Georgia, just south of Big Shanty. On the morning of April 12th, 20 of them boarded the General, ready to execute the plan. We return now to the chase just moments after the General has left Big Shanty. Andrews and his raiders were stopping periodically as planned to cut telegraph lines and use pry bars to pull up sections of rail. But the work was slow. The rails were heavy, and prying them up was an arduous, time-consuming process. Conductor William Fuller, meanwhile, was relentless. After running for miles, he and his two companions found a hand-powered platform car and continued their pursuit, pumping the lever manually down the track. At Etowah Station, Fuller's luck changed. He and his men commandeered the Yonah, a small yard engine, and the pursuit escalated dramatically. The raiders, busy trying to remove a rail, heard a locomotive whistle behind them. They were stunned. They had assumed their pursuers were miles back, still on foot. Abandoning their work, they jumped back on the General and sped north. To slow Fuller, they uncoupled one of the boxcars and left it on the track. It was a minor inconvenience. Fuller, now with a few armed Confederates picked up at Etowah, pushed the car onto a siding and continued. The raiders raced into Kingston, a major junction. Here, Andrews' plan hit its greatest obstacle: the revised railroad timetable. As Andrews had acquired a schedule, he knew he had to pull the General onto a siding to wait for a scheduled southbound freight train. The raiders were forced to sit for nearly an hour, knowing Fuller was closing in. When the station agent in Kingston inquired why the General was running an unscheduled express run, Andrews, a quick and convincing thinker, spun a story. He claimed he was rushing a special train of ammunition to General Beauregard. The story was very believable, and the agent, convinced, let him pass once the southbound traffic was clear. Fuller arrived at Kingston minutes later, only to find his path blocked by the very freight trains that had delayed Andrews. Undeterred, Fuller abandoned the Yonah. He ran to another locomotive in the yard, the Texas. The Texas was facing south, the wrong direction. Wasting no time, Fuller ordered the engineer to run the engine in reverse, tender first, and continue the chase. The Texas thundered backward down the track. The raiders, now north of Kingston, were desperately trying to make up for lost time. They stopped at the Oostenaula River near Resaca, one of the key bridges they were meant to destroy. They doused one of their boxcars with fuel, trying to set it ablaze to block the bridge, but the wood was soaked by rain. The fire sputtered and smoked but would not catch. As they worked, they looked back. To their horror, they saw the smoke of the Texas running backward, closing the gap. Conductor Fuller was on the lead car, leaning into the wind, and he was not stopping. The fate of Andrews and his men hung in the balance, as did the strategic objective of Chattanooga. We now leave the chase in Georgia and move our story forward 14 months, to May of 1863, and shift our focus to a very different kind of man. His name is Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, and he is not a soldier. At 34 years old, he is a quiet, respected professor at Bowdoin College in his home state of Maine. Chamberlain is a scholar, a man of letters. His family has a notable military background. His ancestors had served in the American Revolution and the War of 1812, but his own ambitions were purely academic. He graduated from Bowdoin in 1852 and returned to become a professor of rhetoric and oratory, and later of modern languages. He is a man who speaks multiple languages fluently and is known for his deep, thoughtful, and principled nature. When the American Civil War began, the conflict weighed heavily upon him. He felt a profound, almost personal sense of duty to serve the Union. In a letter to the governor of Maine, Israel Washburn, Jr., Chamberlain articulated this feeling: "I fear this war, so costly of blood and treasure, will not cease until men of the North are willing to leave good positions and sacrifice the dearest personal interests to rescue our country from desolation. The college, however, did not share his enthusiasm and was reluctant to let such a valuable faculty member go. Chamberlain, in a move of quiet determination, requested a leave of absence, telling the college trustees he intended to study languages for 2 years in Europe. Once his leave was granted, he promptly enlisted. His standing in the community was such that Governor Washburn offered to make him the colonel of the newly forming 20th Maine Volunteer Infantry Regiment. This was a high honor, a position of great authority. In a move that reveals the core of his character, Chamberlain declined the command. He wrote that he preferred to start a little lower and learn the business first. This uncommon act of humility defined his approach to service. He was appointed lieutenant colonel, the second in command, and placed under Colonel Adelbert Ames, a West Point graduate and a strict disciplinarian. Under Ames, the professor studied every military work I can find, applying his academic rigor to the art of soldiering. By May 1863, Ames had been promoted to brigade command, and Chamberlain, having learned the business, was promoted to colonel and given command of the 20th Maine. His regiment, however, was green. They had been present at Antietam but saw no action. At Fredericksburg they suffered minor casualties in the assaults on Mary's Heights and spent a harrowing night on the field. They missed the Battle of Chancellorsville entirely, relegated to guard duty due to a quarantine from a bad smallpox vaccine. The 20th Maine was considered inexperienced, untested, and a weak link in the brigade. Chamberlain's first true test as commander arrived not on a battlefield, but in a crisis of discipline that threatened to tear his new regiment apart. On May 23, 1863, 120 men were marched into his camp under armed guard. These were not new recruits. They were the disgruntled veterans of the 2nd Maine Infantry. The 2nd Maine had been a 2-year regiment, and their term of service had just expired. The regiment was officially disbanded, and the men who had signed 2-year papers were sent home. These 120 men, however, had signed 3-year enlistment contracts. The Army, in a clumsily done administrative transfer, ordered them reassigned to the 20th Maine to serve out their remaining year. The men felt utterly betrayed. They were in a state of open mutiny. They had enlisted to serve under the 2nd Maine flag, and they argued that if their flag went home, so should they. They stacked their rifles and refused duty. Chamberlain received these men as prisoners, and his orders from brigade command were explicit. He was authorized to shoot any man who refuses to do his duty. This was a moment that could have ended in tragedy, but Chamberlain saw something others did not. These men were not cowards. They were hardened veterans of 11 hard-fought battles. And, more importantly, the 2nd Maine had been recruited from Bangor, the Twin City, to Chamberlain's own hometown of Brewer. These were not abstract mutineers. They were his childhood neighbors. Instead of using the threat of force, Chamberlain used his greatest skill, rhetoric. We do not have a transcript of his exact words, but accounts make it clear what he did. He gathered the men, not as a warden, but as a leader. He did not threaten them. He sympathized with their plight. He acknowledged the injustice of their transfer. He wrote a letter to the governor of Maine, not to demand the men be punished, but to explain the clumsy situation and ask for his understanding. He then laid the choice before the men. They could remain as prisoners, or they could pick up their rifles and join the 20th Maine as comrades. He spoke to them of the greater cause. Moved by his empathy and respect, all but 6 of the 120 men picked up their rifles and joined the regiment. This single act of leadership was perhaps the most important of Chamberlain's career. In one day he transformed the 20th Maine. His regiment's numbers swelled from 266 men to 386. But more importantly, he infused his green, untested regiment with 120 combat-hardened veterans. These were the men who would help hold Chamberlain's wobbling line together. Without these mutineers, the 20th Maine would not have had the numbers, the experience, or the veteran backbone to do what they were about to be asked to do. Chamberlain's first and greatest victory at Gettysburg was won not with a bayonet, but with words. The regiment, now strengthened, began its long march south. On the afternoon of July 2, 1863, the 20th Maine arrived near the small crossroads town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The first day of the engagement had been a chaotic, costly affair, with Union forces collapsing and retreating through the town. By the morning of the second day, the Union Army of the Potomac, now commanded by General George Gordon Meade, had solidified a strong defensive position. It was shaped, as famously described, like a fish hook. The line began at Culp's Hill, curved west around Cemetery Hill, and then ran south for over a mile along the high ground of Cemetery Ridge. The intended anchor for the entire Union left flank, the very end of the line, was a steep, rocky, 650-foot-high hill named Little Round Top. But the Union line was not where it was supposed to be. The commander of the Through Corps, Major General Daniel Sickles, was assigned to occupy the southern end of Cemetery Ridge, which would have connected his line to Little Round Top. Dissatisfied with this low-lying position, Sickles made a fateful decision. Without orders, he advanced his entire corps of 10,000 men, 3/4 of a mile forward, away from the main Union line. He positioned his men on the slightly higher ground of a peach orchard and a wheat field. This unauthorized move created a salient, a bulge that was exposed to attack from 3 sides. More disastrously, it left the intended anchor of the Army, Little Round Top, completely undefended. The entire left flank of the Union Army was in the air, unanchored and exposed. This blunder played directly into the hands of the Confederate commander, General Robert E. Lee. His plan for July 2nd was to attack the Union left flank and to roll up the U.S. line. He had tasked his most trusted corps commander, Lieutenant General James Longstreet, with this assault. As Longstreet's divisions were beginning to move, General Gouverneur K. Warren, the chief engineer of the Union Army, was sent by Meade to survey this very sector. He rode to the summit of Little Round Top and was horrified by what he found. The hill was unoccupied except for a small Signal Corps detachment. From this high vantage point, Warren could see what no one else could. In the woods and valleys below, the sunlight glinted off the bayonets and rifle barrels of thousands of Confederate soldiers. Longstreet's corps was at that very moment moving toward Little Round Top, beginning their massive flanking attack against Sickles's exposed corps. Warren instantly recognized the strategic peril. If the Confederates seized this unoccupied high ground, they could place their artillery on its summit. From there, they could rain enfilading fire down the entire length of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge, making the Army's position untenable. The battle, and perhaps the war, could be lost in the next few minutes. Warren sprang into action with a desperate plea for any available troops. He sent his staff officers racing down the hill to find anyone who could help. By sheer desperate luck, General George Sykes's V Corps was just then marching onto the field to serve as a mobile reserve. One of Warren's aides found the lead brigade of Sykes's 1st Division. The brigade was commanded by a 26-year-old colonel from Pennsylvania named Strong Vincent. This is the hidden, critical moment of the day. Vincent, a relatively junior officer, was not the corps or division commander. He had orders to take his brigade elsewhere. But when Warren's aide frantically explained the situation, Vincent grasped the emergency in an instant. Without waiting for orders from his direct superiors, he made a decision that amounted to a career-risking act of insubordination. On his own authority, he redirected his brigade to take up position on Little Round Top. His 4 regiments, the 16th Michigan, 44th New York, 83rd Pennsylvania, and 20th Maine, were ordered to drop their packs and race up the hill's rocky slopes. They arrived at the summit not a moment too soon. The race to the top was a matter of minutes, by some accounts less than 10. As the first Confederate regiments began their own ascent, Vincent hastily arranged his line. He placed the 16th Michigan on the right and the 83rd Pennsylvania and 44th New York in the center. That left the 20th Maine. Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, the professor-turned-soldier, led his 386 men, including the veterans of the 2nd Maine, to the very end of the line. Vincent, pointing to the rocky, wooded slope, gave Chamberlain his simple, desperate order. He was to hold this position, the extreme left flank of the entire Union Army, at all costs. The defense of Little Round Top is famously Chamberlain's story, but it was only made possible by Warren's foresight and, most critically, Strong Vincent's glorious, unauthorized decision. The sounds of the main engagement were now roaring toward them. The men who charged up the slopes of Little Round Top were among the best in the Confederate Army. They belonged to the 15th Alabama Infantry, commanded by Colonel William C. Oates. Oates was an aggressive and experienced commander, and his orders, as part of General John Bell Hood's division, were explicit. Find the Union left, turn it, and capture Round Top. If he could get around Chamberlain's regiment, the entire Union line would be compromised. But Oates and his men were advancing under a severe, unseen handicap. The 15th Alabama, along with the rest of their brigade, had begun marching at 3 a.m. that morning. By the time they were ordered to attack Little Round Top at approximately 4 p.m., they had already marched for 25 miles on a hot, dusty July day. They were hot, tired, and lacking water. Oates had requested a brief halt to allow his men to refill their canteens from a well they had passed, but the order came to attack immediately. His men, nearly 600 strong, were now charging uphill, over a field of massive boulders against an enemy positioned behind natural rock defenses, all while suffering from profound exhaustion and dehydration. Among the men scaling that hill was Oates's own younger brother, Lieutenant John Oates. Despite their condition, the Alabamians launched a ferocious assault. The 20th Maine, with its 386 men, met them with a wall of fire. The contest was immediate, desperate, and fought at close quarters among the rocks and trees. Oates's men, seeing they could not break the center, began to stretch to their right, trying to find Chamberlain's flank. To counter this, Chamberlain was forced to refuse his line. He ordered his left wing to bend back, company by company, until his regiment was no longer a straight line but a sharp V shape. This brilliant tactical move prevented the flank from being turned, but it also stretched his line dangerously thin, with some companies reduced to a single rank. For 90 agonizing minutes, the two regiments struggled for the hill. The Alabamians charged again and again. In his official report, Colonel Oates later stated the Union line charged me 5 times and was as often repulsed with heavy loss. The 20th Maine's line held, but just barely. Men were falling on both sides. Nearby, Colonel Strong Vincent, the man who had ordered them to the hill, was struck and mortally wounded, a casualty of the line he had insisted on holding. Then the crisis came. Chamberlain's officers ran to him with the worst possible news. The men were out of ammunition. The cartridge boxes were empty. On the slope below, the 15th Alabama was reforming for yet another charge. Chamberlain knew his line could not withstand it. He also knew that retreat was not an option. If the 20th Maine broke, the flank would be lost, the hill would be taken, and the army would be imperiled. In that moment of desperate resort, the professor of rhetoric made one of the most famous tactical decisions in American history. He ordered a charge. The command was simple: bayonet. The click of steel locking onto rifles flew from man to man. The maneuver was to be a right wheel. The left wing of the regiment, the part that was bent back, would lead. Led by Lieutenant Holman Melcher, they were to charge down the hill, while the right wing held its position as an anchor. The line would pivot, akin to a door swinging shut. This simultaneous frontal assault and flanking maneuver was designed to sweep the exhausted Alabamians off the slope. But this is not the whole story. What happened next is the untold part of the charge. Earlier in the engagement, Chamberlain had made another critical decision. He had detached one of his companies, Company B, under the command of Captain Walter Merrill, and sent them far to the left behind a stone wall to act as skirmishers and guard against a surprise flanking maneuver. They had been hidden there, unseen, for much of the contest. As the 15th Alabama began its final ascent, they were met by the shocking sight of the 20th Maine charging at them with bayonets. Just as the Alabamians wavered, Captain Merrill's Company B rose up from behind a stone wall and fired a volley into the Confederates' rear. This was the final, decisive stroke. The Alabamians, already dehydrated and exhausted, repulsed 5 times, and now facing a bayonet charge to their front, were suddenly hit by a devastating volley on their flank and rear. They broke. A disastrous panic ensued, with many believing they were surrounded by 2 regiments. Oates's line dissolved. Men threw down their rifles and surrendered by the dozen. The 20th Maine took over 100 prisoners. Oates, seeing his brother John among the fallen and his regiment collapsing, was forced to order a full retreat. The hill was held. The victory was not the act of one man, but the culmination of many. The exhaustion of the 15th Alabama, the tactical brilliance of the swinging door, and the hidden decisive volley from the lost Company B. But another story, begun over a year earlier, still awaits its conclusion. We return abruptly to the tracks of the Western and Atlantic Railroad on April 12, 1862. The locomotive General is failing. Its pursuer, Conductor William Fuller, is closing in, his own locomotive, the Texas, thundering backward up the line. James J. Andrews and his raiders are desperate. Their plan to destroy the railroad is unraveling. They had stopped to set one of their boxcars on fire, hoping to leave it in a covered wooden bridge to block the Texas. But their efforts were futile. The wood they had hoped to burn was soaked by rain. The fire sputtered and died. Fuller's Texas simply pushed the smoldering car out of the way and continued the chase. The raiders' most critical advantage, the cut telegraph lines, was also gone. Fuller, knowing the railroad's communication system intimately, had managed to get ahead of the raiders' destruction. Just north of Dalton, before the wires were cut, he managed to send off a message, alerting the authorities in Chattanooga. The element of surprise was lost. The trap was now set ahead of them, even as Fuller closed in from behind. At milepost 116.3, just 18 miles south of their goal of Chattanooga, the General gave its last gasp. The locomotive ran out of fuel and steam. It sputtered and coasted to a halt. With the Texas visible on the track behind them, Andrews gave his final order. The raiders were to abandon the General and scattered into the woods of North Georgia. The Great Locomotive Chase, after 87 miles and 7 hours of high-stakes pursuit, was over. The alerted countryside was not welcoming. The raiders were hunted down by Confederate forces and local militias. Within 2 weeks, Andrews and all of his men, including the 2 who had overslept and missed the train, were captured. The raid was a complete military failure. General Mitchell's planned attack on Chattanooga did not succeed. The damaged telegraph lines and pried rails were quickly repaired by the railroad crews, and the line was operational again in short order. The fate of the raiders was grim. They were taken to Atlanta and held as spies. James J. Andrews, as a civilian operating in enemy territory, was tried and swiftly executed. 7 of the Union soldiers who had worn civilian clothes during the raid were also tried and executed as spies. The remaining raiders endured months of harsh captivity. 8 of them managed a daring escape, while the rest were eventually paroled in a prisoner exchange. But their story did not end there. When they returned to the North, their tale of audacity and sacrifice deep behind enemy lines created a sensation. The bravery of the men who had stolen the General captured the public imagination. In response to their actions, the United States Congress created a new military decoration. On March 25, 1863, the first ever Medals of Honor were presented. The very first recipient to be given the medal was one of Andrew's raiders, Private Jacob Parrott. In total, 19 of the 21 soldiers who had participated in the raid would receive the new medal, many of them posthumously. As civilians, James J. Andrews and William Campbell were not eligible for the military award. The mission had failed to take its objective, but its legacy of heroism became an enduring part of the nation's history.